Good evening, everyone. My name is Alexandra Sinaitis, and I am the Assistant Director for Programming and Public Engagement at the UF Center for Humanities and the Public Sphere. It's an honor to welcome you to Conversation Neighborhood, a public humanities series that addresses questions raised by food consumption and production at a moment in which a global pandemic challenges our physical and social connection. In the past installment of Conversation in Neighborhood, we explore our relationship with fruits, museums, and gave some insights about Latin America with our panelist Liv's experience. Tonight, we are here to explore the ways in which race, class, and the environment influence food access and food choices with a group that can help us think through this particular question. And also this week is a busy one for the Center for Humanities and the Public Sphere. We have multiple events that are happening. Among them, Drone Publics, a human-made machine world with Catherine Schindler, which is part of our multi-year speaker series entitled Data in Democracy, which examines how race and racism, equity and equality, and gender shaped and are produced by technological systems. Since I told you who I am, I would also love to know who you are and where you're coming from. So if you can say this in the chat box, I will really appreciate it. Before we get started, I would like to thank the center staff, Barbara Mennel, Sophia Akert, Kristen Galvin, and Lauren Cox. I would like to thank our collaborators, Tanisha Marshall, Benjamin Orr, Dion Courtney from the Office of Equity and Inclusion in the City of Gainesville, and Wolf from Gainesville Regional Utilities, Manuela Calisi, Imani Stelvin, and Chris. I would like to thank the Florida Humanities Council, which provided funding for this program through a grant for funds from the National Endowments for Humanities. I would like to say that any views, finding, conclusion, or recommendation expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Florida Humanities Council or the National Endowment for Humanities. Lastly, I would like to thank our sponsors, the Chief Diversity Officer, the UF Center for Gender, Sexualities, and Women's Studies Research, the UF Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies, the UF Center for Latin American Studies, the UF Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, the UF Center for African Studies, the UF African American Studies Program, the UF Language, Literature, and Culture, the UF Center for European Studies, the UF International Center, the UF Center for Arts, Migration, and Entrepreneurship, and the UF Office of Sustainability. Just a little housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. I'll bring them up during the webinar and we'll have time for question at the end. Now, without further ado, I will turn this over to Dr. Mamyrah Prosper, who is a visiting professor of Africana Studies at Davidson College. Her doctoral work centered on coalition of social movement organization calling for an end to the ongoing non-governmental occupation of Haiti. She's interested in the construction of neo-colonial nationalist ideologies and collective identities in relation to race and class, gender and sexuality, education and language, and religion. She's currently working on her monograph entitled Development Contested in Occupy Haiti, Social Movement, NGOs, and the Evangelical State, and have published in academic and political journals like Women's Studies Quarterly and Commune magazine. She has also served as an organizer with Land and Housing Rights Organization, Take Back the Land Miami, and is presently the international coordinator for Community Movement Builders. On that note, I'll turn it over to you, Mamyrah.
Thank you, Alex, for this wonderful presentation. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start out by introducing our panelists, followed by some general questions I would like each one of them to address. And so we'll start first with Dr. Diedre Houchen, and she became the postdoctoral associate for the Center for the Study of Race and Race Relations in 2016. She has taught race and education, history of education, and teacher education courses at the University of Florida's College of Education. Her research and writing focus on race, education, and history. Her work as a youth advocate, program developer, middle and high school teacher and educator deepened her understanding of the challenges facing public education. She has published in the areas of urban education, teaching, and learning. Her current work considers Black teacher activism and pedagogy during Jim Crow in the US. Gail Johnson spent her formative years in Gainesville and graduated from Eastside High School and the University of Florida. After founding and publishing an arts and culture magazine about Brooklyn, Gail moved back to Gainesville to raise Zora Sunshine. Gail's grandparents moved to Gainesville over 40 years ago. Her grandfather was the president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and instilled a lifelong passion for education and social justice in Gail, as well as a desire to build a better community. Gail is a small business owner with a passion for food and the local food movement, which she expresses through her catering company, Delicious.Delivered. Check it out. As a working mother and entrepreneur, Gail understands the many challenges that working families face. As a commissioner, Gail will do more to address economic inequalities and work to create a Gainesville where everyone can enjoy the wonderful life and amenities we have here, or you have here. Carla Lewis Miles is a community activist who is dedicated to finding solutions to address the plight of underserved communities at risk for gentrification. She left the field of nursing, realizing that our communities are under attack by predatory developers, unfair development practices, and a lack of protective city policies. She works closely with local, state, and national leaders to develop policies to protect citizens and promote healthy and equitable community development. And last and not least, Karissa Raskin is a civic collaboration specialist in the City of Gainesville's Department of Strategic Initiatives. She works to foster collaboration between diverse local stakeholders in order to build mutually beneficial partnerships that can improve the well-being of our communities. By crossing institutional boundaries and breaking down the silos that separate our communities, Karissa strives to welcome all members into the process of designing, developing, and implementing solutions that can solve some of the complex issues facing our communities. Thank you again, panelists, for joining us in this conversation tonight. And I wanted to pose two general questions to each one of you, and you'll have about 2 minutes to answer before you get the floor for a longer period of time. And generally the questions are about us defining tonight together what food access means, and also what the general misconceptions of food access are. And so we can start in the order of the bios with Dr. Diedre Houchen, and we can follow up with Gail Johnson, Carla Lewis Miles, and finally Karissa Raskin. Thank you.
Greetings, everybody. Thank you so much for having me and asking me to be a part of this panel. And thank you for hosting for us, Dr. Prosper. So let me just start by saying that, as you heard in my bio, a large breadth of the work that I've done and am doing is around education. And what I found to be very interesting in doing that work, thinking about historical African-American segregated school communities, is that there was this implicit tie between land and agriculture and education. And people who I would speak to doing oral interviews would say very clearly, when we were growing up, what we learned is you need to get an education for your head. You need to own some land, you need to know how to work the land, and you need to be able to take care of yourself and your community. And I watched how that discourse changed completely in the last 60 years. Now our purposes of education have very little to do with our food system, agriculture, land ownership, home ownership, and any of those more practical aspects of life, and also philosophical and STEM-based fields, as well as kind of a guiding premise on humanity. What do we need to do to be good stewards of the world so that the world is here for many years? So that led me in an entirely different thread of research around land and food and how those are interwoven in our racialized conversations today. So, the question around food access. What is food access? It is not just as simple as, can I get the particular food I want at the grocery store that's most convenient to me. Let me be clear about that. So when I think about food access, I think, does our region, do the citizens in our region, and you'll notice I use the language of region instead of city or county, because food systems should be regional. They shouldn't just be dedicated to a municipality or a county. We've got to think about this entire system of land and environment and the human systems we build in and around that. And the questions we should be asking, particularly in light of COVID-19 and the crises we are all facing, are, do we produce enough food in our region to sustain the populations that live there? That's an ideal question. Do all members of society have access to that food? In other words, where are our stores located? What are the other outlets for food outside of large corporate food? Food producers such as our Walmarts and our Publix and our Winn-Dixies, and who is producing that food? So there, and I'm assuming we're going to get into this more deeply as the conversation goes on, but food access is a question that relates to every single citizen and their ability to participate in the food system in an equitable and a health and wellness-based way, as well as the policies we create as a region to support that being localized and using sustainable practices for our own economy and the land that we all are governing here. So the misconception, if I would name one, would be, we're just talking about, do we have access to particular foods in particular grocery stores? It's much deeper than that. It's about our land, our development property policies, the kinds of decisions we make, and really envisioning a regional food system that's very different from the corporate one that's left us in the situation we are in. And now with environmental challenges, food shortages, food deserts, and health disparities.
Thank you. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Prosper and the Humanities for having me here amongst these brilliant, brilliant women today. I have a kind of a different take on the question as just a city commissioner, different from Dr. Houchen, because, you know, time and time again, for at least the past decade that I've been here, and certainly the time that I've been in office for the past couple of years, the question has always been, why is there no grocery store on the east side of town? Why are there 13 grocery stores on the west side of town and there aren't any in my neighborhood, Commissioner Johnson? What food access to me looks like in the city of Gainesville, it looks like actual access to healthy, culturally appropriate food in different neighborhoods in our entire city. And that means overcoming transportation, it means overcoming cost. And a question that I am continually kind of asking myself, and I feel like I know the answer to, but I'm not quite sure if other folks are on board with this, is when there is a failure in the market, right, to have grocery stores throughout all of our entire city, then at what point and how does the government step in to fulfill that need? And those are the questions that we struggle with, that, you know, that we've been asking and we've been trying to come up with solutions to, and we haven't quite gotten there. So I look forward to talking a little bit more about this kind of failure in the public, you know, from the this failure in the with our, you know, society and with that kind of the capitalist marketplace, and where government then steps in and fills in with our different policies and solutions.
I have to say, I'm very excited about the conversations we're about to have tonight, just having heard the two of you. And please, I also, go on first name basis, no disrespect for all the brilliant minds here and all the pedigrees, right? I want to acknowledge that. So please, Carla, jump in.
Yes, ma'am. So to me, food access, when I look at food access, because I live in one of these communities, I live in that part of town that Gail was talking about, which is where my passion comes from, having a need right there in our face. And with us, food access for me, because I do social services through my nonprofit, basically, is about the internal controls that people have that create barriers to food, healthy food. For one, it's not just about having a grocery store in the community. It's about making sure that people have the money to shop, making sure that people have transportation to get to wherever they need to be. And even though one of the misconceptions is run into of food access in my community, there's a Walmart supercenter there. And people are under the assumption that, hey, there's a grocery store right there in their community. What are they complaining about? You know what I mean? But there's not a diversity of the types of food that we have, the preservative, the fresh foods that we should have in our community is missing. And in our community where we have the most health disparities, as a nurse, I constantly wear that particular hat. And I look at the types of foods that we have in our community, types of stores. Our communities are packed with Dollar Generals and dollars. And even though they, because it is a capitalist society now, and they're recognizing that we're kind of wanting fresh alternatives to their stores in our community. So they're making a last ditch effort, in my opinion, at throwing some fruit at the counter and doing that. That's not the same thing as being intentional about the type of system. And then I believe as a community, I'm always looking for ways that we can use one pot of funds to do a few things. So we can work on equity, we can work on food system, we can work on entrepreneurship all at one time by just addressing the access to food in our community. So I see opportunities where our food system, like Diedre said, is so much larger and there's so much potential, and it's about making sure all the controls are in place. So we're addressing an entire system and not just saying, hey, they need a grocery store over there out east. You know what I'm saying? But something that's sustainable, considering everybody that's connected to the issues, the farmers, the local food market. What is it looking like for local growers? How do we empower them? How do we improve all of that in that area? So it's about all of it and keeping the accessibility here. We want, redefining what local is, because we talk about local and that comes with policy work. Let's redefine what local is, whereas it was, so many miles away before. Let's try to empower people closer. So it's about looking at all the internal controls.
Thank you, Carla. And Karissa, please join us.
Thank you. There's so much to say in 2 minutes after these three amazing women just spoke. I think there's, we touched on the fact that food access can't be looked at only as a geographic component. And so we can't just be saying, is there a grocery store in this neighborhood? We also can't look at it as a barrier of finances, because sometimes it's not only the financial barrier that prevents people from being able to access the type of food, the culturally relevant food, the food that they, grew up with and should be able to have, at their availability. Sometimes it's just what is being offered in the community, not really meeting the mark for the community, because it wasn't a community conversation that happened around what the food access points, if you will, whether it be a market that it's actually serving the neighborhood in the cultural context that it should be. I think, we could talk about food access in some components. I personally tend to focus more on food sovereignty because I think it encompasses more of the holistic nature of the food system itself. And if we're thinking about the elements of choice, and we're thinking about equity, and we're thinking about like all of the elements that go into a food system, where it's so complex. And Carla did a great job of talking about, how the overlays of the economic resilience into the food access standpoint, if we incorporate, better jobs, even within the food system, then people who are working in those jobs have the ability to have greater food access. I also think that, touching on your question about misconceptions, I think that there's a large misconception that when we talk about food access, we're only talking about emergency food assistance and that like immediate need to serve people who might be without in the moment. And sometimes that people who are without in the moment, it's a long-term issue. Whereas I think that a misconception in our community is people don't realize how close so many of us are to being without food. That some of us are really just one natural disaster away, one paycheck away, one COVID-19 pandemic away from, you know, being in a position where we hadn't really had to think about food access as an issue for ourselves before, and now are faced with that and realize, you know, the barriers are a lot more complex than what we may have previously assumed them to be. But I think my fellow panelists here did a great job of covering the majority of this question.
I imagine there will be a lot of overlap in some of your discussions, and I look for contrast as well. So as I said before, in terms of the format, I'm going to have some specific questions that I pose to each panelist, and each person will have about 7 minutes or so to respond. So the first set of questions are for Dr. Houchen. I'm going back to the titles. You started touching on this already at the beginning, and if you could talk a little bit more about some of the historic policies that have come to contribute to this unjust food system, what scholars and activists alike are calling, right, food apartheid. And if you could, since you've been talking about the regional, us moving into a regional framework to think about food access, if you could talk about the current state of the regional system in which Gainesville is a part of, right? And I think that those would be interesting additions to what you've already started pointing us to. Please.
Sure. And I'm Diedre. I'll be just Diedre. It's good. So I'm going to try to move us through a lot of time as a people very quickly. And I'm going to start with, 3000 BCE. The original inhabitants of this land that we're living in now, Alachua County, where the majority of us are listening from and I'm presenting from, are the Timucua people, more specifically the Patano people, right? So that's the indigenous residents of Alachua County, and they were here up until the 1760s. And these were farmers. These were Alachua County's first farming population. They were decimated first by the French, then the Spanish, and then the British, and finally Americans. And the last 100 of that population either became assimilated into the Seminole Nation or left for Cuba. So that's what and I mention that out of respect for our indigenous population here, across the state, across our nation and our world. And I also mention it to say America's relationship with food has always been tied to race, genocide, oppression, enslavement, commodification, racial capitalization. Food is not neutral, and shopping at your local grocery store is not a neutral act, nor is consuming food. So if I were to answer a question about when did United States policies related to food become unjust, the answer is they always have been. Now, I'm going to try to zoom out so we can talk about the big picture. So agriculture has always been a major contributor to the American economy, first since the country's founding and through African Americans being enslaved and brought here as the country's major agricultural producer and workforce, and through the practice of sharecropping. But Africans brought to this nation incredible knowledge of food production, crops, seeds, and practices. And we here, particularly in the South, also have a long history of poor white Southerners who were working as sharecroppers and as small farm owners. And I think we need to explore and think more about those class alliances and not just the racialization of food. So during the 1900s, what essentially happened is the United States became more industrial and our food sources became more corporatized. So we had large corporations deciding what foods would be on shelves and owning what we call monocultures of fields. So you have, 1,000 acres of wheat, thousands of acres of citrus farming, for example, in Florida. And that's the period where we went from this regional food system to a national and global food system where the majority of our labor, our food labor in the United States, shift from being African Americans to the communities we're calling and lumping together as Latinx communities, farm workers from Central America, from South America, from Mexico, and often from the Caribbean. And at this point in our history right now, over 50% of the food, the agricultural labor in the United States is provided to us by undocumented workers. I try to make that point really clear here in Alachua County because that's often hidden. We don't have a large migrant population of farmers right here in the county, but they're right outside the county. So I've learned a lot about that conversation from the Rural Women's Health Project. Their website is www.rwhp.org. I'd highly suggest you take a look at that and learn about the struggle. All of that to say, this globalized food system that we have, which is incredibly unjust, relies on the work of racialized farm workers, also results in great disparities in our own communities and neighborhoods. I just want to say very briefly that in 1920, there were 929,000 Black farmers in the United States. By 1980, there were 33,000 Black farmers. We lost nearly 1 million farm workers, Black farm workers during that time. The same thing happened with women farm workers, with women farm owners, indigenous farm owners. Who produces our food matters. That's the source of wealth generation, of knowledge, of passing along some of that culturally appropriate food that we're talking about and participating in this food system. So where we are today is we largely have a regional food system that relies on national influences to dictate what we grow here and what our food options here. In other words, we're negotiating with Publix to say, are you willing to put a grocery store on the east side of town in an area where you don't think the income of the residents will sustain that store? That's not the position we should be in. We should be in a position where we're thinking about the farmers in this region, the farm workers in this region, and how can we create closer connections to our food sources in a way that sustains our own economy and allows us all to prosper from that wealth and that knowledge, and also support growing a regional economy here. Now that's a whole lot of work. And I didn't even mention the environmental policies that are related to that. The fact that we have contaminated our water sources, the fact that we've ruined arable land related to pesticides, et cetera. All of those are the complex conversations we should be having now about food access to ensure that at a time like COVID-19, that all of our residents here in Alachua County have the ability to be food secure because we have some relationships with the food producers and we have outlets for those markets in our network. And we've built an economy where we're hiring our own people to work along all aspects of that continuum. That was a lot.
That was
I think we're done. I think we're done.
That was super important in terms of the scales at which you moved to tell us, right, about the history of food access, right? Just thinking about your county and zooming in and out. I appreciate that. And I think it lends very well to the questions I'm going to pose Gail now, right? As a commissioner on the state, on the side of the state, right? To talk to us about what kinds of food policies Gainesville actually has, right, on the books versus, right, what you're imagining to implement in the future. And then to maybe touch on some of what Diedre is already pointing to, right? What is this food supply chain, right? In which that you talked about looking at your scale of the city, right? But how are you imagining thinking about this food supply scale in light of the current policies and also where you hope to bring Gainesville in the future?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I'm going to start off by saying that I don't have the answers, and the commissioners do not have the answers. Sometimes staff does not have the answers. I'm going to tell you who has the answers. The people that are most affected living in the communities that we are not serving very well. And what I see happening, actually what I see not happening, is us connecting with everyone well enough to understand what the solutions could be, offering people options, and then getting enough community input to then move forward on something. So this entire conversation that we're having, it's not about necessarily what I think or me or mine and my policies. It's 100% about the community. So I'll start with that. Two, the community has come up with some really, I think, interesting, important, and forward-thinking models that folks have that we've seen around the country. Working Food is one of those entities. Dr. Houchen works in this space. Certainly, Ms. Miles works in this space with getting input from the greater Duval neighborhood. So there's one thing that's been brought forth that we have not moved forward on yet, but I have an interest in, is healthy food, connecting healthy food with entities already in neighborhoods, whatever that looks like, right? I think it's called the Healthy Food Program or something similar to that. So that's something that has been floated. We have been talking about an urban agriculture ordinance, which means that you can grow food in your front lawn, backyard, wherever you need to. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about the hyper-localization of food, which I feel like needs to happen. So like Karissa said, we do a lot here in this city, in this county with emergency food assistance. And that seems to be kind of the go-to solution for everything. And what I feel like we need to focus on is teaching people how to grow their own food, how to access food that is, and this is going to take a building out of a system, like Dr. Houchen said, but there is food right in our backyard. There are farmers, there are cows, it's right here. So how do we build that bridge in order to make sure that forever and ever, amen, the people in our community will have food when and if local food systems break down and people aren't able to get food, and the USDA and Farm Chair can't send their trucks like they do every week, right? Like, we have really got to stop thinking about that, because also another conversation that we need to have is about how healthy that food is and how good that food is for our body, right? So Farm Share, I'm not knocking folks because it is food, but if we really have the important conversation about what we're putting into our bodies and how that's affecting us, and we overlay the food deserts with the heat map of diabetes and morbidity and infant mortality, we know where everybody is living, right? So I feel like I'm going all over the place here. But when we start thinking about how to empower people to grow their own food and build out the system where people have access to the food in our community, which is automatically healthier, we will then become a healthier city. And that's an interest of mine also. What else do I have to say about this? I think we just need to think about, we need to do a lot more work around what is possible here. I find that the community says what they want, and then what we do is take that and then twist it and try to come up with a million different other solutions when the community says this is what we want. So that is the failure of us as elected officials, as us being servants of the people and listening and doing the good work that they want us to do. So that has been my personal frustration over the past couple of years, is about kind of the political will that it's going to take to be able to build out these systems. Like Dr. Houchen said, it takes time, it takes effort, but Lord knows when the city wants something to happen, they can get it done. We can, right? This is really about us prioritizing the people that live out east, prioritizing the solutions that people have come up with, and prioritizing community engagement as solution around those, community engagement around those solutions to then be able to move to the next step. And that's where we are not. That's where I want to see us go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gail. You brought it. I'm just saying. Yeah. Yes, thank you. And I think this bodes well with, I believe, what Carla will have to say to us in terms of her experience on the social movement end, right? So if you could talk a little bit about your work. You mentioned you had a nonprofit that helps to ensure our community's more vulnerable members. So I understand that most of you listening are from Gainesville, but if you could give us a little picture of, right, when you said you live in this community, right, that Gail was speaking about, and what kind of work you're doing there to ensure or to make up for the lack of work of the states, right, the lack of work that the city is doing, right, which is what you're feeling. If you could give us a sense of what that is, and talk a little bit about this food apartheid that your community is experiencing. There's already a question in the chat about, well, can you define food desert? I think we've already moved away from that and are talking about food apartheid, right, to bring in the point. And if you could give us a picture of what that looks like and the kind of work that you're doing to fill in, to step in for the state.
Well, just to tap on food apartheid, I think all of that conversation that Dr. Houchen or Diedre tonight talked about is just that's just it. That's what the issue is. And so if anybody know me, like people say I'm a community activist, I like to say actionist, because the problem has been defined over and over. And then we have definitions, we have academic definitions, we have our own, the community has their. I'm looking at solutions. And just like you said, and you touched on it well, what my organization focuses on is not just being a conduit to build the relationship and the partnership to do the meaningful community engagement that Gail Johnson talked about was missing with our elected officials. And so one of the ways that what we focus on is interim solutions, right? It's going to take a while for the policy work. Karissa, I think we've been doing food service coalition to do just some of the things I heard you ask earlier about a policy. And I was waiting on them to say, you know, what are some of the food policies in Gainesville? I was like, I can't wait to hear this one because I don't know of any. But so there may be one or two, but if they are, I don't know of none. So anyway, so we have been working with the food service, not that they're not willing. So some steps have been taken. And as a member of this community, Greater Duval, if you don't know about the community, East Gainesville, one of the oldest African-American communities in East Gainesville, very little change happens there for the better. About 15, 20 years ago, maybe we got a Walmart built. That is our grocery store. And so we have a couple of Family Dollars that are around. This is the area where all the dots are on the map. So whenever you talk about jobs, whenever you talk about housing, whenever you talk about vacant property, all of those things are here in this community. And so what we look at is, how do we do something different than the traditional responses that we have to food access, right? So we have our food pantries and we have food lines and we have these big giveaways. One of the things that COVID kind of uncovered for us was just what Karissa was saying earlier, how most of us are one paycheck away. And how do we get something that's more sustainable than a food giveaway? Something that's more, I can tell you after the third week, and I'm like Gail and everybody else, I am not knocking food and however we can get it. God bless the fact that we had the extra, because some people were hungry. But when I tell you, if I saw one more box of spaghetti noodles, because my group was also responsible for handing this stuff out. So we have bulks and bulks and bulks of stuff that we don't eat. And just because we're hungry and the need is there, you know, when you start talking about apartheid, that's when that kick in. Because even though we're doing food giveaways, are you giving us something that we eat? Most of the time, no. You know what I mean? And so one of the things that we started looking at was how do we fill in that gap for our community and then show other community members. One of the first initiatives we did, and we actually started back in the day with Karissa, kind of leading the charge, working with us, and we started community gardens. So we wanted to do just what Gail said, or Diedre, I don't remember, but we started to educate our community. We can't wait on them. We can't wait on them to make the connection between the farmers, even though we have now the Alachua County Food Shed Network that is starting to form. And this is to empower farmers and communities and try to move towards us having our own grocery stores. I did some research on a cooperative model of grocery store that is owned by the community. Some of them fail when not enough work has gone into the planning, but I think it's a sustainable model if we put enough engagement into it and get the community to buy in to have that ownership of it and make sure that it's working the way it's supposed to. Also, I work for Habitat for Humanity in my professional. And so one of the things that I promote in my job, because we build houses, one of the things I want us to focus on is looking at food accessibility in everything that we do. So when we start building that house, let's do edible landscaping. Let's do something, let's promote fruit trees instead of palm trees, regular palm, you know what I'm saying? So we put that food at that house, teach people how to grow that stuff. And so that we can start to fill in that gap while we're working with the city. And then to hold our elected officials accountable. And I know for a minute in our community, right? So I believe in holding elected officials accountable, don't get me wrong. But there's also a level of accountability that lies on us in the community, because a lot of times we have these thoughts and ideas and we promote them, and even sometimes putting them on paper is not enough. We have to push for them. And then when we don't get the leadership, we have to show up to vote. So it's a whole thing that we have to make sure that people are prioritizing food, that we have elected officials, that this stuff matters, not when they're in the seat, but when they're running for office. So when we start talking about elections and different things, we need to be talking about our food at every aspect. And I like to talk about a little piece, you know, the history of our food. I would like to see us re-educate our community on what our food is. Because a lot of people go, they need access to their foods and everything. Well, don't get me wrong. I love me some chitlins. You hear me? I eat them, but that is not the history of my people. That is the history of the slaves. You feel me? And our history didn't start in slavery. And so I want to work on educating our community about different food types and doing more interactive things like learning how to cook different foods. How do we prepare our foods? I can eat that, and don't get me wrong, I still eat them, but only at Thanksgiving. And I don't eat a whole plate, I eat a little bowl. You know what I'm saying? Because I know the effects that they have on my body. And I'm not culturally bound to them and tied to them because they're my grandmother's recipe, because they're not the recipes of my ancestors. And so it's about educating our community so we bring them over and we're looking at our food different. If we look at it different, we may advocate for it a little bit differently. And then Gail's work may not be so hard. You know what I'm saying? Because we'll be inside of these meetings and we'll have some viable plans for our community. So it's not just about having one side and hoping they figure it all out. It's about us learning, being willing to be open and talking and building that communication and doing our part in our community.
Thank you so much, Carla. I love edible landscape. I mean, that's where it's at. Yes. Karissa, I think, you know, Carla pointed to you a couple of times, right? Since, you know, you are on the side of the state, right? I don't mean to create any kind of animosity here, right? But this is what each folk, here are representing. And if we could talk a little bit more, right, in your bio, we talk about, communities, right? And some of the questions that are already coming through the chat are about understanding this landscape of food apartheid in Gainesville and connecting to some of what Carla is talking about, right? What are some of the initiatives that are happening with the community directly, particularly around, right, like culturally appropriate education around nutrition and food access too, right? I think those are very specific kinds of concerns that we have here. Even, if we're thinking about some of the questions that are popping up in the chat, right, to Carla's point about how neighborhoods are organized and what access do people have to, right, supermarkets, but also what's being sold in those supermarkets, right? And how those can come to impact race relations also in Gainesville. I know that's a lot of question, right? But perhaps you could attack around, right? What are some of the city's initiatives to ensure that groups like Carla's group, right, are coming into the conversation and to Diedre's point, right, shaping, and to Gail's point, right, shaping what kind of policies are set.
So that's the problem with going last. You have a lot to respond to. So in 7 minutes, I'm going to try to answer some of that question and also respond a little bit to my colleagues here. And I just want, for clarification purposes, so I am currently the Civic Collaboration Specialist for the City of Gainesville. And in that, I am one of the staff that Gail referred to as being the folks at the city who are, helping or hoping to be working on some of these initiatives to help, take the vision that Gail has set out and the other commissioners have set out and help to realize it. And that vision inherently comes from the community. I also come with a background from working at the University of Florida, and so have a little bit of that lens as well from a research standpoint. Worked with Carla for, goodness, we were reflecting on how long we've worked together the other day, and it just goes back. And then my respect for Diedre and her work and the bringing in the social justice lens of agricultural farm workers is really the lens that I worked at as a researcher at the university. And so I bring that context to say, I think it's really important, especially in my role, is do away with labels. Let's do away with silos. Let's do away with institutional, I'm over here, you're over there. As Diedre said eloquently earlier, if you are a person and you eat food, you are a part of the food system. And therefore, we need to be thinking about it from a very holistic, collective perspective, because what one of us does inherently impacts what another one does, even if it is an indirect link. So I just want to set the tone for that collaborative, holistic mindset in the beginning. I think to speak to some of the initiatives that are currently going on in our community. So Gail had mentioned an urban agriculture ordinance. That is actually something that generated from work over at our law school and in collaboration with some community members who really saw this need to have security for community members who wanted to not only be growing their own food, but to be doing it on a larger scale and to be able to be vending some of that food in the community. And when you don't have that protects the land tenure to enable people to do that within city limits, it makes it very challenging. That's an issue that we've seen with community gardens across the state and really across the country, is this issue of land tenure. And when you don't have, the security, it's very easy for development to come in and quickly wipe out the community garden that may have been sustaining families for quite some time. And so I am happy to say that ordinance is being brought to the city plan board. It's been bumped back a couple of meetings, so please nobody quote me on this as it's out of my control, but I do believe that it will be presented in early December. So anyone who's interested, that's a publicly posted meeting, you're welcome to tune into the city plan board seeing that. And then also the city commission, Gail, I want to give you a shout out, because in our action agenda for the city commission and what we're doing as part of our strategic plan, one of the highest priority items around policy is the, it was titled previously the Food Desert Elimination Action Plan, but actually has been developed into the Local Food System Action Plan, recognizing that we can't only take this geographic and household income definition that is brought by the USDA for urban or rural areas, which Gainesville really isn't either, we're suburban. And so looking at it from a holistic standpoint of what does our local food system need to be more robust? And there's a variety of different initiatives short term, medium term, as Carla pointed. We need something to, you know, put in the hopper while we're waiting for the long-term systemic changes to happen. And these are all ideas generated by our community from a workshop that the community engaged in about 2 years ago, exactly around this topic. And so there was a question, I think somewhere in the questions that you proposed, Dr. Prosper, about, you know, what is changing and how are we learning from what we've done in the past. I really do think that we're starting to listen to our communities. I think, you know, the voice that has come from what Carla was saying with the Greater Duval Neighborhood Association and the coalitions of some of our local farmers coming together to be able to provide this feedback. I'm going to give another shout out to a local organization, Grace Grows. They are a horticultural training program that works or in partnership with Grace Marketplace. If any of our listeners are familiar, it's our homeless shelter and service center in our community, and the horticultural training program that they've developed actually just was awarded a USDA grant and is engaged and embedded in the community, doing community-driven work to help define what solutions meet the needs of that community in terms of food access, and then how can the city and other institutional partners come in to support that. So back to my first statement about it's more than just the silos, it's the collaborative model. We need to be listening and learning from what our community members are saying, but then backing it up with the resources that institutions and policies can support to make that happen. I would go into more detail about the specific things that are going to be presented to the commission, but I don't have time. So tune in January, there will be a workshop where we're going to be discussing some of these short, medium, and long-term solutions that were community generated to really help set the tone for what this action agenda is going to look like. So, and Food Hub is definitely one of the ones that I'm promoting. So stay tuned.
Much. Lots of questions that are popping up. But I also, before I give the floor to our audience, wanted to ask each one of you to take some time to tell us about what you hope to see in the next 10 years in Gainesville in terms of food access. So your wildest dreams, right? And what you intend to work on to make food access possible in Gainesville, and take into account, right, that of course, when we say community, though yes, each individual person is part of the food system, right, that they're different people are have access to food differently, right? Which is, I think, the point we're trying to lift up here. So yes, what is your vision for Gainesville post-apartheid? Or, you know, I don't know if we can achieve that in 10 years, but perhaps that is your vision, right? But if you could share with us, each one of you, in the order we've already been following, what your vision is for the next 10 years.
This order was serving me well until this very moment. All right, so
tell us what you dream of.
for sure. Very randomly, I'm gonna do exactly that. Tell you some of the things that I dream about. I think the first thing that I'll talk about is I think we definitely need to have robust conversations across class, all of our residents, about what healthy food is, what processed food is, how it relates to your health, what culturally appropriate. We need to do a better job. And someone posed, I believe it was Dr. Moore, a question in the chat about that with regard to food nutrition education and food literacy. We don't have that conversation anymore in the public space. We assume that the commercials we get on TV do the job of educating us with regard to food, and that's not going to cut it. And I want to be very clear that I think our citizens are ready for and demand a complex conversation about nutrition and economics tied together. So why does it cost more right now to bring organic kale to the table than regular kale? And what can we do to get those prices down? And what is certification cost? That economic component with regard to producing food, and food labor needs to be in that food literacy conversation. And there are other areas of the country that do a better job about that. I mean, I worked at a youth program here 15, 20 years ago where young people were talking about food miles and the costs of food. So having shorthands for those discussions in a way where the public can easily enter into that conversation and you're not listening to people lecture about it is really important. That's some of the work that Working Food is doing here and attempting to continue to do here. So that's one thing. Here's another dream of mine. A dream of mine is to see that Black plate chefs, African Americans who produce food out of their home and sell plates to people through social media are embedded into our culinary economy. We help figure out what the barriers are to them being entrepreneurs are removed. And we get them some organic kale and organic collards to put on that plate that they're getting with people, as well as people like me who live over on the west side of town know about this entire industry that's happening often on the east side of town. And I got to go to Publix and get a sub. No, I want the plate. So that's an entire economy and cultural economy that is brilliant. That's just not interwoven in our wider food system here that I want to see become interwoven. I want to see, and this is me learning from our county and our city commissioners who are thinking about these issues. I want to see land, the best use of land be determined as agricultural land or environmental land, not just development. We need our land. So can we start considering that idea of best and highest use as being something for our growers here in Alachua County or something to conserve? I want to see more aggregation and production hubs for our farmers. How can we get all our farmers to get together, build places, because we lost them when we lost a regional food system, where we can bring their stuff to market. And then finally, I want to see beautiful outdoor markets full of people of color, Black and brown people on the east side of town, outdoor and indoor markets. I want to see the products that those people want and create sold in those markets, and those to be culturally vibrant, joyful spaces where I can go buy some food and then dance a little bit. That's my dream, my ultimate dream for Alachua County, for food to not just be something where you have to have money or wealth to access the joy of food, but it's actually fun, enjoyable, healthy, lively for all of us here in Alachua County. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Diedre said so much. I agree with everything. I would like us to start approaching this from the standpoint of nobody is coming to save us. That Publix isn't coming to save us, Wards isn't coming to save us. What can we do and we be responsible for that is ultimately going to be in the best interest of our communities? And to me, that looks like, once again, hyper-localization. It looks like the food that we eat being produced, grown, farmed, supported by our local farmers. Instead of having a Publix or a Wards, or shout out to them, they provide great services, but I would like to see community local food markets that are staffed by the people in the communities, that are supported by the people in the communities, that it is a local economy and a system that feeds back in to the health of our community. Because we know that, maybe outside Wards, but we know that Publix and Walmart, all of that money is being recycled out. Most of it is being recycled out of our community. I want it to be easy, like Diedre said, for people to eat well. There is no reason why we should be spending $1 million on organic food because of the way the system is set up. Like, so overall, I see in 10 years, local food markets in every community. I see it being staffed, led, and built by people in this community. I see connecting and building the systems for us to eat our local food here from the farmers and the producers of meat here. I see us overall like not commodifying food and water and air and housing. So overall, like that's the city that I want to see, where everybody has access to the basics, including food, and we don't, it's not a commodity.
Well, I mean, I feel like you guys are all pitching for me to move to Gainesville here for this time that you're envisioning. Please, Carla, tell us.
So
your dream.
all of what they said, first of all, all of what they said, but also in a community that lacks business and development, I would like to see more food related businesses, restaurants, to do just what Diedre said. Gail and I have had this conversation. We need to create a pathway for entrepreneurships that is not our traditional. We have programs like Jeep and other programs. They work well. One of the first things they tell you when you want to open that business is to borrow some money from your family. Yeah, that kicks us out in our community a lot of times off rip. So that education is not as helpful or impactful for us, but I think it would be interesting to look at what a partnership would look like with nonprofits, our city or county, to create a space for incubation of small businesses. So in a community like Duval, and this is a type of restaurant model I would love to see in my community, if we can create the space and remove the overhead for small businesses, just for a few years, work with them while they're saving money, create a process for these small food-related entrepreneurs to actually realize their restaurant. Working Food did an awesome job of having the incubator kitchen. I would like to see that done on a restaurant style, so people they know how to handle their line. They know what their orders look like. They know how to order their food. They have the practicum place, and to use that as a center to educate our children on how to cook food and do more robust education. So when I envision Gainesville, I envision healthier eating going on in my community. I envision culturally diverse spaces. I have a Caribbean background, and we have a restaurant that I may be able to sit in and listen to music. We have some great food trucks, but a lot of those small businesses have a hard time trying to set up and do the startup place, and just creating a space where we're addressing, remember, I like to address a couple of things at one time. So if we're addressing the lack of business here, and helping entrepreneurs to launch food-related businesses with the understanding that, hey, if you come through our program, maybe you open that restaurant over here. We have people that make tremendous sweets and cakes and decorate and all that, and all they have is social media. And just to have an avenue where we have sweet shops and coffee shops with these people, like Diedre said, from Facebook, you know what I'm saying? Because we got salad people and just all kind of wonderful talent in our community we need to help realize. And I also want to do that around our hair, but that's a whole different conversation. But right now we'll stick with food. We'll stick with food. But I would like to see just restaurants opening by people that live in our community that can cook. I want to go back to having places like Mom's Kitchen and Mama Lowe's and places like that we can go in and we felt a part. And like Diedre said, I could be sitting at Mom's Kitchen, and while I'm waiting on her to fry my food, the jukebox is playing and one of the cooks will come out and dance with me. And it's a place that everybody stopped on their way home. And it was one of those places you got up on Sunday morning, and we don't have those spaces anymore in our communities. Having those spaces is important. So when we look at addressing this, I want city and community members, stop looking at bringing Golden Corral to our community. Stop looking at bringing these franchises and these big business, and look at helping to realize the local talent that we have here. And we can do it possibly. We're not channeling or funneling our resources and investing in the right type of things.
Preach.
Thank you. Karissa.
Okay, so to follow up on all of that, I think I want to start with just recognizing a really important component that I don't think any four of us touched on. So one of the things that I would really like to see, to go back to the discussion of understanding and valuing nutrition and health, and what Diedre was saying about, talking about what is healthy food, what does that mean for our community? I also want people to really understand the value of seeds. And I think Melissa Dessau is someone who, if anybody from the community is in the food system space, you know who Melissa is, and Melissa is a champion, and we need to value the power of our local heritage heirloom seeds, because that, above anything else, is the key to food security. So I had to say that. In addition to that, building off of, some of what all of my colleagues have said, friends, we're friends here, not colleagues. I would like to say that I think there is an immense opportunity within the next 10 years for our institutions, be it our nonprofits and our community. So I'm talking about UF, I'm talking about Santa Fe, Alachua County Public Schools, the Farm to School to Work program, as well as the larger food nutrition program, UF IFAS, our county, our Board of County Commissioners, some of our advisory boards there, our nonprofits like Working Food, Grace Grows, Santa Fe College. I think we all need to be putting our heads together and collaborating around developing what ultimately would be a food hub space, where we have post-harvest aggregation and processing, where we can have value-added components that then speak to the local businesses and the entrepreneurship that Carla was talking about, potentially things that could then generate into an incubator kitchen within that space to enable more restaurateurs who are starting out. I think that there needs to be a retail component to it, so that the food that's being aggregated from our local producers, who now have the space because of that aggregation component to be able to enter into the market stream, also have the ability and the security to be feeding our community, and that food is then made more accessible to our community, so that dollars are staying within the community and not going out to the larger corporations. Because if we bring in somebody who is more corporate, we're going to be losing some of that capacity for community wealth building. So this overall idea of a food hub being that, combination of economic development, retail, value added, job creation, support for our local farmers. I've thought a lot about this. I'm probably not doing a very good job expressing it, but if anybody wants to talk to me about it, I'm happy to. And I think in doing that, we are leveraging the capacity of some of our institutions and nonprofits that already are so good at working in the space that they are, and we're leveraging the work that we're already doing to collaborate into one systemic model that can really be built up. But something that's missing, that critical component that I think underlies a lot of what we're talking about today is, and Carla, here's a shout out to you, we need a community development corporation in our community, which we kind of already have. Thank you, Carla. And we need to be supporting that through a community development financial institution. We need those fundamental components, which I know is somewhat outside of the scope of this conversation, but it's not really. If we're going to go dive deep into it, those are the fundamental components to building things like a community-owned grocery store, like a sustainable, resilient local food system. We need that funding to be able to be flexible enough to be able to sustain the community-driven ideas that may inherently be riskier, and you're not going to be able to get it funded from a traditional bank loan. So you bring in the community development financial institution to support those ideas, along with the capacity of your other institutions. And I mean, you're in a lot better state than we are now. So I think everybody on this call has been doing a lot of amazing work around that space. In the interim, definitely continue supporting our edible landscaping, our workforce development, our youth programming around cooking, all of the amazing, amazing wealth of resources that we have here in Gainesville and Alachua County, which are too numerous to name. Bringing them together to do what they do best, and in supporting something overall that we can all work together on. That's my vision for the next 10 years. The end.
Not yet, but yes. So we only have about 10 minutes left, right? And we have a lot of questions coming from the audience, and I'm trying to connect them into at least one major large question that I can pose to all of you before we part. And I'm trying to thinking through rather everything that's been said tonight. And it seems like our conversation is revolving around over and over again land, right? And land relations and who controls that land determines everything about everything we've been talking about, right? And to my understanding, University of Florida is the largest employer in town. And so part of the critiques that some folks are already bringing up in the Q&A, right, is that development is understood mostly around questions of infrastructure, but also centered around perhaps a transient student population rather than the people who are living there and perhaps working for the university system or not, right? So I guess I'm really wanting us to unpack this question of land tenure, right? Which is really about land ownership. And we know, as we said, right, what happens even with the urban program that we're proposing, right? How does it actually work if people are always moving out of their apartments, right? Being gentrified out, right? To make room for the student population. So it seems that our conversation is really about land, who controls it, right? And how do you imagine a Gainesville in 10 years where we're really providing food, where we're really making food accessible for all without also talking about who owns the land and these economic policies that we're promoting, if it's not talking about that very issue, right? That we're not necessarily in the making of future laborers for UF or any other major employer that's probably not coming anyway, right? And we're dislocating people from their ability to be on the land, to decide the institutions they want to put in place, right? And also to control what they put in their bodies. I would like for us to talk about, right, the developers in town who make the decisions about land and their relationship. I know this is hot. I'm like dropping it. Right, if UF is the main employer and the developers are centering, right, their ideas of development around infrastructure and around, therefore centering around the student population, how do we really move into these dreams that you have for 10 years if we don't go down to the issue of land and who owns it?
And a short answer, we go in blazing. No, I'm just so that was I almost fell out my chair because that was like the whole big old fat elephant sitting in the room, and you know, kind of what that looks like. And to be honest, I would love to hear someone else speak to this. I just had to say that was a very heavy questionnaire.
It's heavy. It is heavy, and it's something that we have been discussing in this community, especially over the past, like, you know, couple of months with specifically a moratorium on development. And it is because the you know, the mom's kitchen and that we anymore, Mamalos, and the erasure of Black people in this city and in this county is systemic, and it is happening willfully, I believe, based upon policies that we either do or do not have. So, for example, you know, the University of Florida is getting rid of a third of affordable of graduate student housing. What does that look like when it's not replaced? There have literally been, from 2017 to 2020, close to 9,000 beds, student housing beds that have been built from 2017 to 2020, with another 800 coming online within the next 6 months, right? So that's almost 10,000 when there have been multiple affordable housing complexes, you know, not taken away, or, you know, being bulldozed for, you know, single family housing that is, you know, that's more upscale in certain neighborhoods. So it's the responsibility of all of our largest landowners, right, which is the University of Florida, the city of Gainesville, the county, the school board. I think that we need to come up with a comprehensive, you know, strategy and plan together, because we can't necessarily control what people do with their private land, but what we can talk about is the land that we own, and what collectively can we do to make sure that there is some type of, you know, land for for entrepreneurs that want to build businesses, that there is some type of land set aside for affordable housing. And then, you know, the next question is where do we get the money to then build that? But then at least there is a conversation happening amongst our largest institutions. And that right now is not happening. I want to see that happening in our city. That's what I have to say right now. There's so many thoughts that I have around this. But overall, we're talking about structures and systems that at the core and foundation do not work for working people. And when we talk about that, we have a different conversation that probably we should not be broadcasting on, right now with one of our largest institutions. But that's a conversation that the entire country is having right now. And I have my thoughts about the way that I'd like to see that work out. That involves a reallocation of power, of land, and some real thought giving to the reparations that need to happen.
I'm just jump in with regard to the reparations. I think that that's part of the story that we need to make public with regard to who lived on the land that is now the University of Florida 50 years ago, 75 years ago. And the short story of that is essentially what African-American families did UF buy the land from to build the University of Florida? So tracking down that story and passing it and putting that back in the public space is important. So we see where we lost some of lands as African-American farm owners and landowners, as you're talking about reparations with regard to our large institutional practices, Gail. The other part that I just want to add are the issues of heirs property, which we haven't talked on much here, which we're starting to do some work around in Alachua County. I think we're better than we were 10 years ago, but how can we conserve and preserve the land that people own now and might be tied up with regard to title or deed restrictions? And how can we preserve farmers' land right now that we're losing to development? And that's absolutely the case. We took a tour of a farm about a month ago, and all around this farm's land are single family home communities that are being built, that are back up to the property of this African-American historic farm owner in an area that once was a historic African-American community and is no longer. So my contribution, what I'm hoping to do is tell those stories, keep those in the public domain so that we're aware of what our situation looks like with regard to land and the people who have lived on it over time.
Can I just
please.
One last thing, and the other part of that, just when I heard your question, all I was thinking about, we need some money. We need somebody to prioritize the ideas and thoughts that we have from the community. It's one thing to tell the community to stand up and talk about all these plans. We don't have no money. So we, but who is willing to invest in us? And so one of the things Karissa spoke on it earlier was a separate entity, the Community Development Corporation that I'm laying the foundation for, is exactly where this type of house and this type of work. The beautiful thing about community development corporations is they come with their own set of funding, specifically for ideas, specifically to realize these and to spark the community development, the positive community development. And so these are entities that have been popping up. There are not a lot of them in Florida. We're starting our well, not the first one, but the first community-based model of one that is a true community development corporation right here in Gainesville, and so that we can house this work, so that we can be the agency to focus on the food system while the city does the larger thing. And this entity tells a story because we did the community first summit a little while ago, and we learned that it's going to take all of these pieces actually moving to make a significant impact and make that impact be sustainable. So there's not one thing, and this is going to be the thing that we do. We got to get Diedre to tell the story. We got to get Gail to work on the policies. We got to get Karissa's department to make sure the sustainability. You got to get me to get the community on board, and all of that has to be done, and it has to be done collectively and in partnership. And I think that's what we're starting to do really well.
It's a good thing we're friends.
Yeah,
it's a good thing all of
we
us.
spend a lot of time together.
I think, you know, to add on to that last part that Carla was saying, and probably for the majority of people listening in, this isn't the first time we've been discussing this, and this is something that we are all so passionate about. And, you know, again, to the question of, you know, how have things changed over time? I mean, just in my short time, the last, you know, 5 or so years working in this space, I think the amount of collaboration, the amount of awareness, the amount of discussion around food systems, around collective capacity building, and around really community-driven solutions. I maybe it's my own bias because I work in that space, but I really do feel that there is change happening and a movement. And so I would just say, you know, there's a lot that we can glean from other communities, and we can look at them and in some ways say, you know, oh, they're so much further than us, why can't we just get it together? But I think it's also celebrating the little wins. And I think, you know, the fact that we had a panel tonight where we did really show we all have certain lenses, certain skills, certain perspectives and expectations bring to the table, but with this shared vision of what we want for our community and everybody who's listening, I really think that there's a lot of power in that. And so I would just encourage people to stay engaged, don't get discouraged, and, you know, just play your part in it, because as Carla said, you know, it is our institutional leaders, it is our policy leaders, but it's really, it comes down to the community and, you know, making it what we want it to be. So that's a little feel good for the end.
Yeah. And actually, I wanted to say, Carla, in my experience in Miami, the development community, I forgot what it's called now, right? The acronyms are always long, but the community development corporations were the ones who were driving gentrification because they were not really community-based, right? So I would love to be able to follow up, you know, on your work to see, right, how you are actually implementing a community vision around this corporation that's connected to the state, but to bring in the money. And, you know, I hope that folks too will stay tuned to the work that you guys are doing on the ground. And, you know, I'm very excited about what you guys are thinking through and what you're hoping to do in 10 years, and that I might join you one day in person.
Absolutely.
And so thank you so much for sharing your perspectives, your experience, your visions with everyone tonight. And I look forward to being in conversation with you at other times. And I'll give the floor back to Alexandra. And, you know, again, this has been amazing. I'm very happy I spent this time here hearing from you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. So this food access, race, class, and the environment panel explore, among other things, the state of food security and challenges that we have in Gainesville. So with Commissioner Gail Johnson, Dr. Diedre Houchen, Karissa Raskin, and Carla Lewis Miles, and also Mamyrah, also with your experience with Take Back the Link in Miami and the International Coordinator for Community Movement Builders. So I will say with the issues raised, we notice that there is so much to discuss, right? And I think with Conversation in Neighborhood, we will do just that in the present installment, especially with ecology of food engineering. So Melissa will join us to talk about food sovereignty as well, in conversation with other activists, more like from a global perspective with other activists, one from Kenya. We will have Dishes of Africa in the African diaspora, where we'll have different chefs or home cooks from the diaspora, from Africa in the diaspora, that will talk about green dish, so around collard greens, spinach, and so on. And we will have in February, and then we will have who is growing local food in March. So we'll have conversation with some local farmers as well. So I will also add that the center do offer some public humanities grants, which is focused on collaboration. So for instance, to tell the stories, Diedre, you can always apply for those particular grants. And even people listening in, they can always reach out to me and I'll be more than happy to talk to them about the grants that we offer. So they can actually have some events, humanities events, focus event, and other conversation on this particular much needed discussion. And I also hope that I will see you on Thursday for Drone Publics, a human-made machine world with Catherine Chandler. And on that note, I'll thank everyone for coming in today, and I'll hope seeing you at the center of other events. Thank you so much.